On June 12, 2024, the DEA announced the largest cryptocurrency money laundering bust in U.S. history. Operation Fortune Runner. $50 million seized. 24 arrests across 3 countries. But here's what they didn't say in the press release. The operation wasn't actually about cryptocurrency. It was about solving a riddle that had stumped American law enforcement for a decade. Why were Mexican cartels suddenly able to move drug money faster, cheaper, and more invisibly than ever before? Why had the traditional money laundering routes, bulk cash smuggling, trade-based laundering, wire transfers through shell companies, suddenly become obsolete? The answer wasn't hiding in the blockchain. It was hiding 7,000 miles away in the gleaming skyscrapers of Shanghai and Shenzhen, where a parallel crisis was unfolding. China's wealthiest citizens were trapped, and the cartels had found a way to set them free. To understand how we arrived at this moment, you need to understand the cartel's oldest and most persistent problem. Cash. Not the lack of it, the abundance of it. The Sinaloa Cartel, Jalisco New Generation Cartel, and their competitors generate between $3 and $5 billion annually from drug sales in the United States. Most of that revenue comes from fentanyl and methamphetamine, sold in quantities small enough that the majority of transactions happen in physical currency. 20s, 10s, sometimes 5s. Money that smells like the streets it came from. This creates a logistical nightmare. $1 million in $20 bills weighs 50 pounds. It fills 2 large duffel bags. Now imagine you're moving not 1 million, but 3 billion. That's 6,000 duffel bags, 150,000 pounds of paper. And every single one of those bags needs to travel from Los Angeles, Phoenix, Houston, and Chicago back to Mexico, where the cartel's leadership can actually use it to pay soldiers, bribe officials, purchase precursor chemicals, and fund operations. For decades, the cartels relied on what law enforcement calls bulk cash smuggling. Couriers would pack vehicles with false compartments, drive across the border, and hope they didn't get stopped. It worked, but it was dangerous, inefficient, and expensive. Seizures were common. A single interdiction could cost the cartel millions. Then came trade-based laundering, using fake invoices and shell companies to disguise drug money as legitimate business revenue. Better, but slow. The entire process could take weeks or months, and it required a complex web of complicit businesses on both sides of the border. Wire transfers through banks were faster but suicidal. After the September 11th attacks, the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network became one of the most sophisticated financial surveillance operations on Earth. Any significant money movement triggers algorithms. Patterns emerge, accounts freeze, arrests follow. By 2010, the cartels understood that the traditional banking system was no longer a viable option for large-scale money laundering. They needed something else. They just didn't know what. Enter Martin Mizrahi. In 2021, Mizrahi was the 47-year-old CEO of http://lv.net, a small internet service provider operating out of Las Vegas. His company provided broadband connections to local businesses. Nothing glamorous, but stable. Somewhere along the way, Mizrahi discovered that his access to cryptocurrency exchanges made him valuable to a very different kind of client. The operation was almost absurdly simple. Cartel associates would arrive at his office with duffel bags containing hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. Mizrahi would accept the money, charging a commission of 10 to 15%. Then he would log into his Coinbase account, a mainstream US-based cryptocurrency exchange, and purchase Bitcoin using his business credentials. The Bitcoin would be transferred to anonymous digital wallets controlled by the cartel. From there, it could be converted into other cryptocurrencies, moved through mixing services to obscure its origin, and eventually cashed out in Mexico through local exchanges or peer-to-peer networks. No border crossing, no smuggling, no customs agents. Just a laptop, an internet connection, and a willingness to ignore where the money came from. Between 2021 and 2023, Mizrahi laundered over $4 million in cartel drug proceeds. He also processed $3 million stolen from a New York nonprofit through a business email compromise scheme and ran $8 million in fraudulent credit card charges through his company's payment systems. He wasn't a criminal mastermind. He was an opportunist who understood that cryptocurrency had created a gap between law and enforcement, a space where money could move faster than investigators could follow. Mizrahi likely rationalized his role with the same logic that many white-collar criminals use. He wasn't hurting anyone directly. He wasn't selling drugs. He wasn't pulling triggers. He was just providing a service, a technological service, no different than processing a payment or facilitating a wire transfer. The fact that his customers were cartel operatives was, in his mind, incidental. The technology was neutral, he was neutral, and the money, once converted into Bitcoin, became just another string of alphanumeric characters on a screen. Clean, abstract, disconnected from the violence that generated it. But Mizrahi's operation, while lucrative, was still small-scale. $4 million is significant, but it's a rounding error compared to the billions the cartels needed to move annually. What the cartels really needed wasn't just a money launderer. They needed an entire infrastructure. They needed a system that could handle volume, minimize risk, and operate across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. They found it in the most unlikely place: China's underground banking networks. To understand why Chinese money brokers became essential to cartel operations, you need to understand a policy that most people outside China have never heard of: the $50,000 rule. Since 1997, the Chinese government has imposed strict capital controls to prevent massive outflows of wealth from destabilizing the economy. Chinese citizens are permitted to move a maximum of $50,000 out of the country per year through legal channels. For the average person, this isn't a problem, but for China's rapidly expanding class of millionaires and billionaires, entrepreneurs, tech executives, real estate developers, it's a cage. These individuals have accumulated enormous fortunes inside China, but they face a constant risk: the Chinese government's unpredictable regulatory environment. Businesses can be nationalized, assets can be frozen, investigations can be launched with little warning. Wealthy Chinese nationals want to diversify their holdings, purchase real estate in Vancouver or Los Angeles, send their children to universities abroad, or simply secure a financial escape route in case their political fortunes change. But the $50,000 limit makes this nearly impossible through legal means. Underground banking networks have existed in China for centuries, originally serving diaspora communities who needed to send money home without relying on formal banks. These networks operate on trust and ledger balancing rather than physical money movement. If someone in New York wants to send money to Beijing, they don't wire it internationally. Instead, they give cash to a broker in New York. That broker contacts a partner in Beijing, who delivers the equivalent amount in renminbi to the recipient. No money crosses borders. The two brokers simply owe each other, and they settle accounts periodically through trade transactions or other mechanisms. By the early 2010s, these networks had evolved into sophisticated multinational operations, often referred to as money service businesses or remittance networks. They moved billions of dollars annually, serving both legitimate clients, immigrants sending money to family members, and illegitimate ones. And they had one asset that made them uniquely valuable to Mexican cartels: vast reserves of US dollars sitting in American bank accounts. The convergence happened quietly, without press releases or public announcements. Cartel leaders realized that Chinese money brokers had exactly what they needed. The brokers controlled enormous pools of American currency collected from wealthy Chinese clients desperate to move money out of China. The cartels, meanwhile, had enormous pools of American currency that they desperately needed to repatriate to Mexico. It was a perfect match: two separate problems that could solve each other. In January 2021, Edgar Joel Martinez Reyes, a key operative for the Sinaloa cartel, traveled to Monterrey, Mexico. Intelligence reports suggest he was there to finalize an arrangement with Chinese money brokers who had been operating in Mexico for several years. The meeting was straightforward. Martinez Reyes represented cartel leadership who controlled millions of dollars in drug proceeds sitting in stash houses across the United States. The Chinese brokers represented clients in China who needed US dollars but couldn't access them legally. The proposed system was elegant in its simplicity. The cartel would deliver cash to the Chinese brokers' operatives in cities like Los Angeles, New York, or Chicago. Those operatives would deposit the money into US bank accounts or convert it into cryptocurrency. Simultaneously, the brokers' partners in China would pay the equivalent amount in Chinese renminbi to wealthy Chinese clients who wanted to move money out of the country. The cartel would then receive the equivalent value in Mexican pesos or cryptocurrency in Mexico. The entire transaction happened on ledgers and through digital transfers. No bulk cash crossed international borders. No wire transfers moved between cartel-controlled accounts and Chinese accounts. The money simply changed hands locally on both sides of the Pacific, with the brokers acting as intermediaries. This system, which DEA agents later called mirror transactions, offered the cartels several critical advantages. First, speed. Traditional money laundering could take weeks or months. With cryptocurrency and Chinese brokers, the entire process could be completed in hours or days. Second, cost. Traditional money launderers charged commissions of 5 to 10%. Chinese brokers operating at massive scale and with lower overhead charged 1 to 2%. Third, invisibility. Because the money wasn't actually moving between countries, only changing hands within them, it didn't trigger the international wire transfer alerts that banks and law enforcement had become so adept at monitoring. And here's where cryptocurrency became not the solution, but the lubricant. Bitcoin, Ethereum, Tether, and other digital currencies allowed the brokers to move value between accounts without relying on traditional banking infrastructure. A cartel operative could hand a Chinese broker $300,000 in cash in Los Angeles. Within minutes, that cash could be converted to Bitcoin at a local cryptocurrency ATM or through a peer-to-peer exchange. The Bitcoin could be transferred to a digital wallet controlled by the broker's network. That wallet could then convert the Bitcoin to Tether, a so-called stablecoin pegged to the US dollar, which could be sent to an account in Mexico and cashed out into pesos. The entire process left a trail, but the trail was fragmented, pseudonymous, and difficult to trace in real time. Blockchain technology records every transaction, but it doesn't record names. It records wallet addresses, which are strings of letters and numbers that reveal nothing about the identity of the owner. Law enforcement analysts could see that Bitcoin was moving from wallet A to wallet B to wallet C, but determining who controlled those wallets required sophisticated blockchain forensics, international cooperation, and often months of investigation. The scale of this system is staggering. According to a United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime report, Mexican cartels launder approximately $25 billion annually through cryptocurrency, internet-based platforms, and e-commerce systems. That figure represents roughly half of their total revenue. In one case investigated by federal authorities, a single Binance account, Binance being the world's largest cryptocurrency exchange, moved $15.7 million through 452 separate transactions between May 2020 and September 2023. The account was linked to Chinese money brokers operating on behalf of cartel clients. But cryptocurrency wasn't just facilitating the movement of drug profits, it was also enabling the purchase of the materials needed to produce the drugs in the first place. A 2023 study examined 120 Chinese manufacturers of precursor chemicals used to produce fentanyl and methamphetamine. 97% of those manufacturers accepted cryptocurrency as payment. This created a closed loop. Cartels could use Bitcoin to purchase chemicals from Chinese suppliers, manufacture drugs in Mexico, sell those drugs in the United States for cash, convert that cash back into Bitcoin through Chinese brokers, and use the Bitcoin to purchase more chemicals. The system was self-sustaining and nearly invisible to traditional financial oversight. The DEA and FBI were aware that something had changed. Seizures of bulk cash at the border were declining, but drug availability wasn't. Overdose deaths were climbing. Cartel revenues weren't shrinking. They were growing. The money was moving, but investigators couldn't see how. Traditional financial intelligence methods, tracking wire transfers, monitoring bank accounts, analyzing trade data, were coming up empty. The cartels had found a way to operate outside the system. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: blockchain forensics. Companies like Chainalysis, Elliptic, and CipherTrace had developed sophisticated tools to analyze cryptocurrency transactions. While individual wallets are pseudonymous, patterns emerge when you analyze them at scale. Wallets that frequently transact with each other likely belong to the same organization. Wallets that interact with known criminal marketplaces or sanctioned entities can be flagged. Transactions that follow certain patterns, rapid movement through multiple wallets, sudden conversions between different cryptocurrencies, large transfers to high-risk jurisdictions, can indicate money laundering. By 2022, federal investigators had begun using these tools to map the financial networks, connecting Mexican cartels and Chinese money brokers. They identified key wallet addresses, traced transaction flows, and correlated blockchain data with physical surveillance. They watched as cartel operatives met with Chinese nationals in Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and New York. They recorded phone calls and text messages discussing packages, transfers, and exchanges, code words that became transparent once investigators understood the context. Operation Fortune Runner was the culmination of this work. The investigation, which began in earnest in 2021, involved the DEA, FBI, Homeland Security investigations, and law enforcement agencies in Mexico and China. Investigators identified Edgar Joel Martinez Reyes as a central figure coordinating between cartel leadership and Chinese money brokers. They tracked his movements, his communications, and his financial transactions. They identified dozens of other participants: cartel operatives, Chinese brokers, cryptocurrency exchangers, and facilitators. On June 12, 2024, agents executed coordinated raids across 3 countries: 24 individuals were arrested. Authorities seized $5 million in cash, 302 pounds of cocaine, 92 pounds of methamphetamine, 3,000 ecstasy pills, and an arsenal of weapons. More importantly, they seized financial records that revealed the true scope of the operation. Over $50 million had been laundered through this network in just 3 years. Martin Mizrahi's arrest came earlier, in 2023. Federal agents had been watching him for months, building a case through financial records, blockchain analysis, and informant testimony. When they finally raided his office and home, they found detailed records of his transactions, spreadsheets tracking deposits, Bitcoin purchases, and transfers. Mizrahi had been meticulous, perhaps believing that his records would protect him by demonstrating that he was simply running a business. Instead, those records became the evidence that convicted him. In March 2024, Mizrahi was found guilty on multiple counts of money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. He faced up to 127 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected the seriousness of his crimes and the volume of money he had processed. In September 2024, he was sentenced to 5 years. The reduced sentence came because Mizrahi cooperated with investigators, providing information about his clients and the methods they used. He likely told prosecutors about the men who brought him duffel bags full of cash, the instructions they gave him, and the wallets where he sent the Bitcoin. But here's the uncomfortable truth that law enforcement doesn't emphasize in press releases. Operation Fortune Runner, despite its scale and success, barely made a dent in the overall system. $50 million sounds enormous. It is enormous. But if the UN's estimate is correct, that cartels laundered $25 billion annually through cryptocurrency, then Operation Fortune Runner intercepted roughly 0.2% of the annual flow. It's the equivalent of seizing a single shipping container when thousands are moving through the port every day. The Chinese underground banking networks that facilitated these transactions are still operating. Some have adapted their methods in response to increased scrutiny. Others have simply relocated their operations to different jurisdictions with weaker enforcement. New Martin Mizrahis are opening new accounts at new exchanges, ready to accept the next duffel bag of cash. The economic forces driving this system, American drug demand, Chinese capital controls, cartel profit motives, haven't changed. The technology has simply made it easier to connect supply with demand. And this raises a deeper question about the nature of enforcement in the digital age. Cryptocurrency wasn't designed to help cartels launder money. It was designed by libertarian technologists who wanted to create a financial system free from government control and corporate intermediaries. The vision was noble in its way, a world where people could transact freely without banks taking fees or governments monitoring their activities. But any system designed to circumvent traditional oversight will inevitably be exploited by those who benefit most from operating outside the law. The blockchain is often described as transparent. Every transaction is recorded permanently and publicly, but transparency without identity is just noise. You can see that $1 million moved from wallet X to wallet Y, but if you don't know who controls those wallets, the information is useless. And even when investigators do identify wallet owners, the process is slow, resource-intensive, and often requires international cooperation that takes months or years to coordinate. Meanwhile, the human cost accumulates invisibly. Behind every Bitcoin transaction in Martin Mizrahi's ledger, there's a chain of consequences. The cash he converted came from fentanyl sales in American cities, pills sold to people struggling with addiction, often ending in overdose deaths. The profits he helped repatriate funded cartel operations in Mexico, fueling violence, corrupting institutions, and destabilizing communities. The Chinese money brokers he indirectly served enabled capital flight that undermines financial stability in China, while inflating housing prices in cities like Vancouver and San Francisco. The technology itself is morally neutral. Bitcoin doesn't care if it's being used to buy coffee or fund cartel operations. But the hands using it are not neutral, and the systems those hands build have consequences that ripple far beyond the blockchain. Every innovation that increases financial privacy or reduces transaction costs creates new opportunities for both legitimate users and criminal networks. The question isn't whether we should regulate cryptocurrency more strictly. That debate is already happening in legislatures and regulatory agencies around the world. The question is whether regulation can ever keep pace with innovation in a globalized economy where money, data, and people move across borders faster than laws can adapt. Operation Fortune Runner will be studied in law enforcement academies as a success story. And in many ways, it was. 24 dangerous criminals were arrested. Millions of dollars were seized. A complex international conspiracy was disrupted, but disrupted is not destroyed. For every network dismantled, another is forming. For every Martin Mizrahi convicted, 10 more are weighing the risk and reward, deciding whether the potential profit justifies the potential prison sentence. The cartels will keep producing drugs as long as Americans keep buying them. Chinese citizens will keep seeking ways to move money out of China as long as capital controls remain in place. And as long as those two realities persist, there will be intermediaries, technological, financial, human, ready to build bridges between them. Bitcoin was just the latest bridge. It won't be the last. Perhaps the real question isn't how to stop cartels from using cryptocurrency. Perhaps it's why we've built an economic system where the most profitable business model in the Western Hemisphere is selling poison to people who are suffering, and where the most sophisticated financial innovations are immediately weaponized by those who profit from human misery. Technology doesn't create these problems. It just makes them faster, cheaper, and harder to see. Share your thoughts below.